Now we continue looking at the legacy of the last apartheid President FW De Klerk following his passing yesterday. I'm joined now by Mr. Mkhondo, a veteran journalist and former Reuters correspondent and founder of the media and writers firm, who has written about the transition to democracy. Mr. Mkhondo has also had several encounters with De Klerk, Dr. Madiba, as well as Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon. What are the memories that spring to mind when you think of FW De Klerk? I mean, at the time you were a young journalist and really at the thick of things.
Oh, a lot of things. I think De Klerk was a person who came at the time when apartheid was at the end of its era, and he had to do something. He was forced to do something. He had no alternative. And for us at the time as journalists, De Klerk and Mandela were people who we interacted with every day, and we wrote about their interactions. I have interesting memories of my interactions with both of them, and it's been a very interesting time at the time, and even now when I think about it. I think my best recollection, or let me say the worst recollection, was in December 1991, when the Convention for a Democratic South Africa began in Kempton Park, and there were speeches were being made at the time, and De Klerk Mandela was the first to speak at the opening ceremony, and then of course De Klerk was the last to speak. Mandela spoke about the importance of negotiations and the value of negotiations and so on. Then of course he spoke about the role that the National Party at the time was playing and so on. And when De Klerk spoke, he attacked the ANC and Mandela of not actually being valued and partners in the transition to democracy, because they had not observed what was then known as the DF Malan Accord. The DF Malan Accord was the agreement that the Mkhondo activities would be seized, and the military would respect protests and so on and so on. So now remember, Mandela had already spoken. After De Klerk had finished speaking, Mandela stood up and said he demands to speak again. So he actually demanded to speak and attacked De Klerk of being a leader of an illegitimate government. I mean, from that day, we knew that whenever Mandela spoke and decided to speak off the cuff, then something interesting was coming. I have never forgotten that day. So why am I telling you this? Because the relationship between Mandela and De Klerk was a love-hate relationship made by circumstances. Both of them were thrust at the time to take our country forward, and they have to work with each other. There are other anecdotes I can talk about, but I think, let me just say that one is the one that I will never forget.
What do you believe were some of the dynamics and the challenges and the experiences that FW De Klerk had, you know, pre-Mandela's release, pre-Dr. Madiba's release, and post? As a journalist, did you notice any sort of transitions in him, in his manner, due to the different roles that he was playing during that transitionary period?
I did. You know, when you interact with different leaders during a long transition, such as the one from 1989, when it was quite clear that Mandela will be released, that the government was actually talking to him, even before then, when the National Party supporters and leaders were flying to Lusaka to speak to the ANC, people like Van Zyl Slabbert, he was not a National Party member, but at least he was concerned about the transition to democracy. You begin to see change in the faces and relationships of some of the National Party leaders. People like, you remember the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bekbuota, who said at the time that there will be a black president in our lifetime. And de Klerk and his fellow National Party leaders were very angry with that statement. They forced him to withdraw that statement. For me, it was quite clear that they could see that the writing was on the wall. So when you, on a number of occasions when you spoke to de Klerk and Magnus Malan, Kobi Kutie, and all the other military men, you could see as they become more and more relaxed when they were talking to you. And even de Klerk, whenever there was a press conference between himself and Mandela at CODESA, which I covered, he became more friendly to journalists, became more open than at the time or soon after Mandela's release. So I think he was moving with the time, and he was accepting the inevitable, but also he was learning as he spoke to people like Paulo Jordan and Cyril Ramaphosa and all the others, that actually negotiation and a peaceful transition was the best thing.
You mentioned a change in disposition, becoming more and more comfortable, and you attribute that to the fact that he was getting to talk to the Paulo Jordans, the Madibas, and building relationships there. But also it
Yes.
was a time of negotiations, like you speak about, CODESA. So
Yeah.
could it also have been that the outcome of these negotiations were perhaps not as catastrophic for him and the National Party as they may have thought they would be? Because at some point feeling like their backs are against the wall, but as the negotiations were taking place, realizing that actually the teeth of this particular animal are not as lethal as they may have thought. Was that a possibility?
Yeah. Yes, it is, because you must remember that negotiations took 3 years. And during those 3 years, you remember, there came, or something called talks about talks was born. In other words, you have a meeting to thresh out what you're going to discuss in another meeting, and in another meeting again. So what has happened at the time was that there were negotiations on what the new South Africa should look like. Now, if you go back to history, you'll remember there was something called the Sunset Clause. The Sunset Clause were some of the benefits that the two or many opposing parties were supposed to enjoy in the run-up to the fully fledged democracy. For example, you know that in the first cabinet there were two vice presidents. The first one was de Klerk. The first one was Thabo Mbeki. The second one was de Klerk. And you know that the first Minister of Finance came from the National Party. So there were those give and take. So when in the run-up to the negotiations and throughout the 3-year negotiations, there were things that the ANC has to give away, and there were things that the National Party has to give away, including the power to rule, that actually made what you're talking about possible. In that, there was a time when de Klerk and his fellow securocrats were aware that actually things are not bad as we thought they would be. And they actually stuck it on and negotiated. But on the other side, the ANC and Mandela were also under pressure not to give too much. The National Party and others were under pressure not to give away too much. So those were some of the nuances that de Klerk and his fellow National Party and securocrats had to actually circumvent.
I'd like you to talk to us about the TRC and De Klerk's role in the TRC, and why it actually didn't come to, I guess, its anticipated, expected end?
Well, you must remember that the TRC was not the product of De Klerk alone, but it was a product of negotiations and also relevance that people had to fess up. People have to come out and talk about what they know and what they don't know. Now, when you are a leader of a national party, when you are a leader of the ANC or you are a leader of a church group like Bishop Tutu was, and when you had the experiences of living in the townships, as I did, I'm a resident of Katlehong, and you know that Katlehong, which was then known as Katoras, Tokoza, Katlehong, and Vosloorus, was the scene of what the apartheid government and De Klerk called the venue for black-on-black violence. But we know that some of those atrocities there were sponsored. So the TRC was meant for people to come out there and fess up and come and talk about what they know. De Klerk apparently, or unfortunately, did not actually explain much of what he knew. In his book, he even sidestepped the issue of atrocities by the security forces. For example, he gives an example of Magnus Malan flying to him to his holiday home in KZN, coming to tell him that he has just discovered that there is an unknown security grouping called Civil Cooperation Bureau, the CCB. This is the security clandestine organization that killed people like David Webster and many other apartheid opponents. Now, you want to tell me that De Klerk didn't know that? And you want to tell me that other people within the National Party didn't know that? They did. Some of them did participate in the TRC, and some of them didn't. De Klerk did, and P.W. Botha refused to do that. And De Klerk in his book talks about how he went to go and see P.W. to convince him to come and participate in the TRC, and P.W. Botha refused. The truth of the matter is there is some things that we got to learn from the TRC. There are some that we didn't hear much about it. Some of us who lived in the township know of many atrocities which did not feature and in the TRC itself. We don't know how it came about yet. Yeah.
Dr. Mkhondo, I have to thank you very much for your time and just taking us down memory lane. You were there during that very period. So thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Thank you for inviting me.
The pleasure is